Deuteronomy, introduction. The book of Numbers ends with Israel camped by the River Jordan on the plains of Moab at the edge of the Promised Land. 40 years have passed since the Exodus, and Israel is about to enter the land that God had promised to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. The book of Deuteronomy records for us the words that God speaks through Moses to Israel as they wait on the boundary of the land. Words that would prepare them for what was ahead. The word land is used more than 100 times in this book. It's repeatedly described as a gift from God. It's described as being good. But it's also made clear that remaining in the land depends on Israel's obedience to God's commands. The English name for this book, Deuteronomy, comes from a Greek word meaning second law. But we mustn't make the mistake of thinking that this book describes Israel being given a second law to the one they've already received. No, in fact, this book is a restatement by Moses of the law given at Mount Sinai, and it's a recommitment to it by the people of Israel. In Deuteronomy 32, verses 46 to 47, Moses says this to the people of Israel: "Take to heart all the words I have solemnly declared to you this day, so that you may command your children to obey carefully all the words of this law. They're not just idle words for you. They are your life. By them you will live long in the land you are crossing the Jordan to possess." By the way, remember that Moses never enters the promised land. We find his death recorded at the end of this book. So Deuteronomy contains the last words of Moses in the Bible. Well, let's look at the exercise on slide 1. Why does the law need to be given again? Please pause the video at this point so you can answer the question. Why does the law need to be given again? Well, remember that the Exodus generation have all died out with the exception of Joshua and Caleb. This is now a new generation of Israelites who weren't at Mount Sinai and didn't hear the law being given the first time. Here in Deuteronomy, we find the law being adapted and expanded and applied to this new generation of Israelites. They're called to be faithful to the covenant they've made as a people with God. Not only does Moses give them a new reading of the law, he also reminds them of their history, of what God in his grace had done for them as a people. And as they begin their life in the land that God is about to give them, Moses encourages them to remember God and to respond rightly to him. They must love him. They must recognize his sovereign greatness and holiness. They must trust him. They must obey him. An outline of Deuteronomy. This book divides into 4 parts. The first section, chapter 1 through to chapter 4, verse 43, looking back. These chapters review Israel's history, and they end with an exhortation to obey God. But the second part is looking up. Chapter 4, verse 44 through to chapter 28. These chapters call the Israelites to covenant loyalty, to remember their covenant with God. This is then followed by a second reading of the law. It's made clear that there are positive consequences, there are blessings that come from God when the law is obeyed. And there are negative consequences, curses that come from disobedience. The third section is chapters 29 and 30, looking ahead. In these chapters, the people renew their covenant with God. This is then followed by a concluding challenge to choose life rather than death as they move forward, to choose God's blessings rather than his curses. And finally, we have a conclusion in chapters 31 to 34. These last chapters describe the final events of Moses' life and his death on Mount Nebo outside of the Promised Land, and the commissioning of Joshua as the new leader of the people of Israel. The importance of Deuteronomy for Christians. Deuteronomy is one of the big four of the Old Testament, along with Genesis, the Psalms, and Isaiah. Deuteronomy is one of the four most quoted books of the Old Testament in the New Testament, which means that we need to have an understanding of Deuteronomy if we want to understand the New Testament well. Another reason why Deuteronomy should be important to us is because this book contains the second listing of the Ten Commandments, or the Decalogue, as they're sometimes called, in Deuteronomy chapter 5. These foundational commands have an ongoing relevance for our lives today as Christians. We also have here the Shema in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 to 5. Shema is the Hebrew word for hear. Hear, O Israel, the Lord, Yahweh our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. This was a core confession for the people of Israel. But, says Jesus in the New Testament, it's a core commandment for Christians too. Jesus describes it as the greatest commandment. He then quotes the words of Leviticus that we've already looked at previously, love your neighbour as yourself, and says that the whole of the Old Testament hangs on these two love commands. Also in Deuteronomy chapter 8 verse 3, we find the words that Jesus uses with Satan in the desert when he was hungry, when he was being tempted, just like Israel was. Man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. Words that remind us that God himself is our provider. Words that remind us that our lives are not simply nourished by the food in our stomachs, but more fundamentally by the word of the living God. But before we finish with the Pentateuch, let's also take a moment or two to think about why Moses is important in our understanding of the New Testament. The importance of Moses for Christians. Listen to the last words of Deuteronomy, chapter 34, verses 10 to 12. This is what is said after Moses' death. Since then, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, who did all these signs and wonders the Lord sent him to do in Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all his officials and to his whole land. For no one has ever shown the mighty power or performed the awesome deeds that Moses did in the sight of all Israel. There's no doubt that Moses was revered among the people of Israel as an important leader. But what do we find written about Moses in the New Testament? Well, maybe the first thing to say is that Moses appears in Hebrews 11 in that list of Old Testament people of faith. Moses is held up to us as Christians as an example of a man of faith in God. We're to be like him. We're to trust God in our lives in the way that Moses did in his. But I also want you to notice that however important Moses was for the Old Testament people of God, in the same New Testament book, Jesus is described as being greater than Moses. The writer says that Jesus has been found worthy of greater honour than Moses. In fact, Jesus is presented in the New Testament as the new Moses. When Jesus feeds the 5,000, the comparison is made to Moses and God's provision of manna in the desert. And Jesus says that he is the bread from heaven that gives life to people. John, in his gospel, makes an astonishing claim about Moses and Jesus. He says that Moses wrote about Jesus. In other words, that when we look at these first 5 books of the Bible, we should expect to find Jesus there. In Deuteronomy chapter 18, Moses states that God would raise up for his people a prophet like him. Moses says that the people must listen to him, listen to this prophet. Now, in a sense, Moses is a model prophet for all the later prophets of Israel. But ultimately, the New Testament writers tell us, Moses' words here point to Jesus himself. He's the prophet like Moses. He's the one who must be listened to. At the beginning of John's Gospel, John writes about the goodness of God, the grace of God that is seen in God giving the law through Moses. But then John compares Moses to Jesus and says that what we have in Jesus is actually grace upon grace. We see even more of the goodness of God, even more of the grace of God in the events of Jesus' life than we do in the events of Moses' life. Time and again in the New Testament we see that Moses points us to Jesus.